Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and happy first day of fall. My name is Kalisha Davis. I am the CS Equity Curriculum Project Director at Kapor Center, and it's my sincere honor and pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening for the second webinar in our 5-part series examining each one of the core components explored in the culturally responsive and sustaining computer science framework released by Kapor Center in June 2021. As many of you know, Kapor Center is a national organization headquartered in Oakland, California, dedicated to removing barriers in STEM education and tech careers for Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized communities. Next slide, please. Part of what we've established as an organizational practice at Kapor is the acknowledgement of Indigenous communities that have held relationship with the land that our organization occupies for generations, has occupied for generations, and the historical and ongoing legacy in this country of colonialism. We hope to engage our colleagues, partners, and communities in discussions, events, and activities to elevate liberatory practices for communities that have been historically marginalized and continue to be marginalized throughout the United States. Next slide, please. With that said, this webinar is a virtual convening created to inform the Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative, a national endeavor launched in 2020 designed to cultivate meaningful approaches to creating more culturally responsive, asset-based, and sustainable practices in K-12 computer science education. To learn more about our work, please visit our newly designed website that I'm going to drop here into the chat, where you can download our strategic framework, view our new video documenting the thoughts and opinions of a few people behind this important work, and find ways to stay connected. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover the following. In just a moment, I'll share a brief overview of the CRCS framework and this core component to offer some context. Kapor Center CEO, Dr. Allison Scott, will set the tone for the discussion with some introductory remarks. Our exciting panel will connect with 3 very special guests who have some really informative and valuable experiences as national thought leaders in the computing and computer science field that will inform our ongoing conversations. We'll have some time for questions from our audience, and then finally we'll share a few words about our next event before we say farewell. While you're listening, if you have any questions for us over the course of this presentation, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address as many as we can. Next slide, please. Now, earlier this summer, we released the first iteration of a comprehensive framework that offers insights to the field while underlining the critical need for culturally responsive and sustaining practices within the K-12 computer science classroom. This work lends to an intentional and persistent investment in Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized students and communities. This resource is research-driven and was developed and reviewed by a national collective of well-informed, respected, and recognized leaders in the fields of K-12 computer science education, racial equity, social justice, community building, technology, and a variety of other relevant disciplines. Next slide, please. The CRCS framework offers two key elements: a shared definition of culturally responsive sustaining computer science pedagogy, and an articulated set of core components for implementing culturally sustaining computer science pedagogy in school communities. Next slide, please. This slide articulates our shared vision that aims to move beyond simply providing access to computer science courses to ensuring that every student has the opportunity to be inspired and thoughtfully engaged in ways that speak to their interests, identities, and cultures, and validate their place in the computer science classroom, as well as the entire computing world. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates our 6 core components. We hope that each of these will serve as a resource to educators and help directly inform their instructional practices, curriculum development, and approaches for implementing equitable opportunities for K-12 computer science education. Next slide, please. With that in mind, the second core component is what we're here today to unpack, which first involves the co-creation of inclusive and equitable classroom cultures that cultivate meaningful learning experiences and ensure belonging for students from all backgrounds. In addition, this component involves the exploration of individual and collective identities among teachers and students, which can be utilized as tools to create inclusive classrooms, ensure a sense of belonging for all students, and help school communities achieve equity. Next slide, please. So how do you begin to bridge this gap and create more inclusivity in the computer science classroom and in school communities? Let's go a bit deeper with our colleague and the CEO of Kapor Center, Dr. Allison Scott. Allison?
Thank you so much, Kalisha. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for being here today, and also to our guests who have joined us. So I'll provide just a few remarks about inclusive practices in CS education and what we mean and why we think they're so important. So we spend a lot of time focused on the foundational disparities in CS education. So that whether we're talking about whether students, regardless of race, gender, economic status, or geography, have access to computer science courses and instruction in their schools. And we know that we've not yet achieved equity and access. And in fact, we have quite a ways to go. But we also know that access alone is insufficient to ensure equity. One quick example, we know that male and female students are equally distributed among the high-income schools that are most likely to offer CS, but girls are much less likely to participate in these courses, and girls of color are even less likely. So it forces us to examine the conditions that exist within computer science classrooms. What are some of the unique implicit and explicit messages which force students to feel that they belong or feel isolated? Which students feel that the instruction and curriculum connects to the things that they are most interested in and motivated by? So, research has helped us to kind of understand inclusion and exclusion, particularly in STEM and CS. So research by Claude Steele about the impact that stereotype threat can have on both performance and interest in fields that students are underrepresented. And research by Sapna Cherian about the impact of classroom environments and something that seems as seemingly small as the posters that are on the walls in classrooms and the ways that they signal inclusivity or belonging to specific groups. This is why we think core component number 2, creating inclusive, equitable classrooms that allow all students to feel a sense of belonging and connection is so critical. So we're thrilled to have this discussion among 3 amazing leaders in the space who have exemplified the ways to prepare teachers and build inclusive CS classrooms that will enable all of our students to thrive. So without any further ado, I will kick it back to Kalisha to introduce our panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, as always, for providing that really important context. So let's get to this amazing panel. Let me quickly introduce our 3 guests. First is Lynn Diaz. Lynn is a founding director of the Constellation Center for Equity and Computing at Georgia Tech. She brings the essential core foundation of equity and access and opportunity to computer science education. and her role as the Director of Educational Innovation and Leadership helps establish the Constellation Center as a leader in expanding computer science education through an equitable and comprehensive approach in national, international, state, and local educational systems. Lynn is also a cherished member of our Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative's National Advisory Board. Welcome, Lynn. Up next is Dr. Maya Israel. Maya is an associate professor of educational technology in the School of Teaching and Learning at the University of Florida. She's also the research director of the Creative Technology Research Lab. Prior to entering higher education, Dr. Israel was a special education teacher, and her research focuses on strategies for supporting academically diverse learners, meaningful engagement in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, with emphasis on computer science education and universal design for learning. Dr. Israel was a writer on the K-12 Computer Science Education Framework, as well as the revisions of the Computer Science Teachers Association's standards for computer science teachers. Lastly, Dr. Israel works with multiple school districts on systemic and classroom strategies to more equitably include students with disabilities in K-12 computer science education initiatives. Welcome, Dr. Israel. And last but certainly not least, we have Meg Ray. Meg teaches the computer science education courses at NYU Steinhardt and is also a freelance computer science education consultant. Meg was responsible for instructional coach training at Cornell Tech, where she was the founding teacher in residence. She is also an experienced high school computer science teacher and curriculum developer. Meg is the author of the book, Code This Game, having worked with a host of students in such capacities as software engineering, special education, theater, LGBTQ, and youth support as a youth support specialist. Her experiences inform current work developing curriculum and supporting teachers. Welcome to you, Meg. So clearly, this is an incredible panel of thought leaders with insights on this topic, and we're eager to jump in and discuss. So panelists, thank you so much for being with us this evening. All right, so let's get started. We first want to kind of set the tone, and I would love to be able to pose this question to all of our panelists. What is your definition of an inclusive and equitable classroom?
All right, silence. Okay, so I'll start it off and hopefully my colleagues will take it from there if that's okay. Thank you, by the way, so much for having us here. We're thrilled to be with you and presenting with all of you and learning together. When I think about an inclusive and equitable classroom, it's one where all students feel like they belong, where instruction is designed for them and with them, and where they feel empowered to learn, to create, to work collaboratively, and that where they see that the differences between each other is a strength rather than a barrier.
Thank you, Lynn.
So I will go next, and just to add that I do think a part of an equitable and inclusive classroom also elevates students' voices, and it acknowledges their own perspectives, meaning their perspectives are honored, and that there is an environment where it is truly a community with the students.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lynn. That's Dr. Israel. What are your thoughts about this question?
I just went, so I think I'm going to give that to Meg.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo what both of you said and maybe just rephrase it as every student feeling that they have ownership within the classroom and ownership with over their own learning.
Awesome. Thank you, Meg. How has the global pandemic impacted how learning can take place? Lynn, would you like to share? Yes.
I guess I'll start. I've been very fortunate, like Maya and Meg and many of our attendees tonight, to be connected with teachers and with students, and just kind of get a sense of, the experiences that they've had over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, in terms of, this pandemic. And I can tell you that it ranges, but specifically, I'll talk about, the schools with, I would say, the low resource schools, or the schools that are super stressed, because of the economic disadvantages that they might be facing, with students and families and whatnot. In that it is those schools that I believe that have been negatively impacted the most, where schools, had to shift very quickly from being a place of community and learning and providing the best academic, experiences for students, to a place where we had to make sure that students' well-being was prioritized over academics. And I believe that shift actually made a lot of educators realize that should always be the priority, that the students' well-being, it is about safety, but their well-being, their mental health, their, being able to nurture students, the whole, as a whole, person, that should always be the priority, regardless of where the school, or the community is located. So I've had lots of conversations with educators, about that. And I'll just share some student experiences. Yes, there are challenges in connectivity. There are challenges in getting the right equipment and making it work, and and kids being on video, kids not being on video, and those are all different challenges. But it has also made us a little bit more aware of how students learn, whether they're in person or whether they're across on a screen. We need to pay a lot more attention to how students are learning, and provide opportunities to excel and still achieve, whether they're in the classroom or whether they're on video. Some students have actually indicated that they have thrived, as much as what, however you want to define that. But some students feel a lot more comfortable interacting via the chat, whether they're on video or not, camera or not. They feel it's less threatening for them to be asking questions if they can ask it in the chat, as opposed to being in person. They've also were not afraid to share, because it was on chat, and they weren't, sort of in person. And that makes us realize how much sort of, how much we need to still work in making classroom environments non-threatening for students, such that they feel safer behind a screen or on chat. And so, it's really, this global pandemic has opened up opportunities to have those kinds of conversations. There also have been students that have struggled, for sure. They need to be in a classroom environment with a teacher who can nurture their learning experiences, in person. That is also very important, to kind of factor in into positive, inclusive, equitable learning experiences. But this pandemic has provided, a lot of challenges, but more so opportunities for us to truly have deeper conversations about the challenges that have surfaced. I don't want to dominate. So Maya and Meg, I'd love to hear your perspectives as well.
No, I agree, Lynn, with everything that you said, both in terms of positive outcomes that have resulted from the pandemic, which are, in addition to, Lynn, what you mentioned, for the teachers that we work with, who work with students with disabilities, they're have kind of been forced to try out the technologies that provide access anyway, right? So things like closed captioning, which are now built into Zoom, they're built into all these systems that they weren't using before. Thinking about accessibility of technology is something that they've always had on their minds, but actually the tinkering and the playing with the technology because they have to use it in a remote setting, I think that's been a positive. But kind of on the flip side, we've been working very hard to advocate for the inclusion of students with disabilities in computer science education for a long time. And we've been making some headway, which has been positive. But since the pandemic has hit, we have really taken many steps backwards. If we think about individualized instruction, which is what is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's a mandate that allows and requires for individualized instruction based on student needs. The priorities have been on those core academic content areas, as well as, Lynn, what you were talking about in terms of just kind of like the emotional well-being of students. So computer science has really taken the back burner for many students with disabilities. And so now that we're living in this environment where, online and flex instruction, there's been a lot of work that we've had to do both on the advocacy side of things, but also in terms of building resources for teachers and for administrators to help them meet the needs of students who need that, either face-to-face instruction, or if you think about a child at home learning online whose parents are working and then they need individualized instruction, that adds an additional layer of challenge as well. So certainly opportunities for us to support teachers, and we've seen some positive outcomes, and we're trying to highlight those, but a lot of challenges right now because of the pandemic.
Mhm.
Yeah, just echoing how this has really brought community to the forefront. The last decade or so, we've seen a trend towards trauma-informed schools. We know about 1 in 4 students have been affected by trauma. Well, now we know 100% have, because we know that isolation is not good for a developing brain. Isolation from their peers, right, is not good for a developing brain. So even if students are healthy, even if they're thriving online, they've still experienced a collective global trauma. And so now we all need to be trauma-informed educators. Also because we have also experienced that trauma. So it's all the more important to push that training out to teachers as well. Sort of like Maya was saying, teachers were forced to use technology. Now, hopefully, this will also move forward trauma-informed instruction and classrooms as well.
I really appreciate everything that you all said. Like I'm just taking notes of these various ideas, but the last part of that collective trauma and the need to be more informed as educators in addressing that trauma, it definitely resonates for sure with me. Because I wanted to ask a question about this idea of young people being global citizens, and how they can begin to view themselves as a part of a larger world around them, even if they're in a pretty homogenous type of environment where the students look like them, they maybe come from a similar kind of socioeconomic background. There may not be many young people that appear to be terribly different. Like, how do you begin to incorporate an understanding of what's happening in the world, even if that's not a young person's everyday experience? And I will start that question. Lynn, I'd love for you to share your thoughts about that.
Okay, thank you, Kalisha. I'll try to keep it brief. So I just want to first start out by saying that I can't emphasize enough how the role that CS education has in helping students become global citizens. It is a must in our society today and in the future. And I think that CS education must aim to equip the next generation of students to address a wide variety of complex problems in the world, perhaps problems that we haven't even yet encountered, right? And we need to do a much better job at that, to sort of build on having them think about, what issues concern them, what their interests are. And it remains absolutely critical that the people with computing skills that are going to be solving these problems, that they are representative of the world that we live in today and for tomorrow too. Students of color, Hispanic students, Latino students, Black students, Native American students. This is their world too, and they belong in CS classrooms. And so in our CS classrooms, what we've envisioned is we're working to provide students an opportunity for them to take lead in studying the issues and the context that they're interested in. I mean, I think this is one of the biggest outcomes in the AP Computer Science principles in terms of the significance of the exam, where one of the as part of the exam, they create a program, but they get to choose that topic. They get to choose what they want to do. They even get to choose the programming language. It's a start. I'm not here to talk about just AP CSP, but it's that notion that that they have that power to choose what they want to study. And we need to allow students to convey their interests and leverage that in the classroom. It can be music, it can be art, it can be sports, it can be law and policy and social justice. We need to show educators that all of these topics belong in the computer science classroom, especially if the students are bringing them up. We need to honor that and help teachers integrate that into learning experiences. And I think if we do this more, that this prioritizes who the students are and what they bring into the classroom. And my guess is that once we start doing that, we can surely increase their sense of belonging in a discipline that has not included them for far too long. So we need to empower the students in our CS classrooms.
Mhm. I love that. Thank you. Prioritize who students are to help ensure their sense of belonging. Meg, this work really requires more intention, especially for educators. What are the consequences for maintaining the status quo and not thinking in the way in which Lynn just described, helping young people have more critical thinking and creativity, addressing a variety of different problems, even those that we haven't encountered yet?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is that we'll keep going as we are, having the tech industry be filled with people who are not representative of all of the users, right, of technology. And we'll have a small group of people who hold power and who create that technology and make all the decisions over it. And that technology is increasingly having very personal effects on our lives. When we think of the role AI plays in the criminal justice system, in social services, in finance, all of these areas that touch all of us. And then thinking about what a small group has power right now. And that is becoming more of a crisis as AI and other technologies affect us in more and more ways, right? And then the other is just that it can do harm to students. If students don't feel welcome in a classroom, it's educationally harmful. And so just thinking in that term, those terms, teachers don't want to do that. They're there because they love to teach and help students. So helping them to meet that goal is really important.
Mm-hmm. Certainly appreciate that. Like breaking through those barriers and really diversifying what it looks like to be a part of, the computing world. Dr. Israel, what are the initial steps that an educator needs to take to ensure that inclusion and equity become a regular and ongoing practice in their classroom? Because some people, you have a sense that that's what you're doing, but how do you make sure that that's what you're doing?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. And I think I'm going to turn it around a little bit by saying that I guess first, it's what is the responsibility of administrators and others in the community to provide professional development and support to the teachers to do so. Because kind of going off of what Meg was saying, the teachers we work with want to do right by their students, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to do it. And when we're talking about frameworks like CRSE, Universal Design for Learning, these are really complex, and it takes time both for self-reflection and for learning collectively in order to enact these. I liked how you were talking about this as a practice. So any of these practices, right, I think it takes some support and some learning. So I think I'll start with that, but then, in thinking about those and assuming that those supports are in place, the main thing to start with is critical self-reflection, right? What are our own experiences? What are our own biases? What are our assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't belong? And I think that when we all sit in those, we recognize the biases that are within ourselves. So I think recognizing that is a really important first step. The second is to learn about these inclusive practices. So thinking about the CRSE framework that you have, thinking about Universal Design for Learning and other translanguaging supports, like it's about, let's learn about these frameworks and trying to enact, not think about the perfect right here. Let's just try and start somewhere and reflect on practice. I think a lot of times teachers see these frameworks and they become overwhelmed because they can't do it all, but they can maybe take pieces of it and start and see how that works for them. I also feel like another really kind of nugget that I tell new teachers to this is that there are a lot of resources available to them in their school building, in their districts, in our community. So for example, in thinking about students who might need assistive technology, there are special education teachers, there are assistive technology specialists, there are other people that they could reach out to that will have that expertise, and they could say, I'm doing this unit in Scratch or in code.org or with, some robotics. What are some things that I can do in order to make sure that a student is included? And often what ends up happening is that they create a lesson and then they think about something different for the students who may not have access to that. And so when they work with others, I think it's a challenge to think, how can I build a flexible instructional environment that includes everyone and not just like planning for, whatever this elusive average learner is as well. So I know that kind of goes beyond what you were asking, but I guess that's a part of the answer.
No, you addressed a number of questions that I have in here because that was the next thing, was to talk about identity exploration. Before we kind of hop forward, I do want us to just touch on parents and family and their involvement in this. Like, teachers are certainly carrying a lot of weight, and the students themselves. How can parents and families get involved? What can possibly be done at home to help them feel like they can be supportive, especially when it comes to computer science? And that's an open question. Maybe Meg, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think learning together is really important. A lot of families may feel like, oh, well, I don't have training in this area. I don't know how to code. So, my son or daughter will have to do that. But as of learning together as a family, as a parent or guardian and child, is a very powerful and supportive experience. I think another is thinking about within our cultures, like what are the sort of jobs or careers that we expect or don't expect, and what are the biases around that. And I think on the school level, welcoming in families, creating opportunities for families to learn together and to explore different career opportunities for their student together are great ways to support families in doing that.
Mhm. Love that.
I would just add to that a little bit and just saying that, students, as they're working and developing computational artifacts and things that are meaningful to them, creating this space for them to share that with families and other people in their community is powerful. It brings the families into the experiences that the students have and into their own creation. We also have, we were talking about kind of our own personal biases about who belongs and who doesn't belong. Families have similar biases, right? So having those discussions with families help us be able to have that conversation more widely. So in terms of, thinking about what Dr. Scott said about, girls and in the, in communities where computer science is offered, but they may not be as represented. So having those conversations with families also is important because it addresses that, because the parents and the families are really the best advocates for their students. And so bringing them into that conversation is critical.
Mhm. So when it comes to identity exploration, we talked about the importance. Are there some best practices or examples in schools and, an instruction that can help serve as a form of inspiration for our audience and for others?
I think language is of primary importance when I think about the practice of translanguaging in the classroom, where students' languages are welcomed into the classroom and encouraged, rather than just tolerated or seen as a problem to overcome. But when they're seen as a strength and integrated into the classroom culture, I think that's a really strong practice to have. And it goes beyond, like, we could think about language as far as like cultural or national identity, but also we can think about the language students use about themselves. Like when I think about disability identities and becoming aware of ableist language in the classroom, there are other ways to sort of examine the language that's being used and welcome students in using that language.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Meg, I wanted to piggyback on that because something that we are working on currently is finding different modalities for students to be able to communicate their thinking, their problem-solving process, their questions in multiple formats. I mentioned like the chat earlier. Believe it or not, kids are really good at texting their ideas. Maybe it's through a particular software. Now there's like, Menti where, or Poll Everywhere or different, software that allows students to express their knowledge, their concerns, their questions in different ways. Some students, really need like different ways to express that. I know that is slightly different from the translanguaging and the languaging that you were speaking of, but it made me think of the different, modalities of communication that can be provided in a computer science classroom to, respect and honor different ways that students like to communicate their ideas. And in computer science, I think that is especially important. To take the barriers away, particularly from some females too, in a classroom that is dominated by males in a computer science class. They may not always want to raise their hand in a classroom. They may want to communicate their thinking in a different way. That's just one example, that has come up a lot.
Mhm.
I love that. And now I want to build off of that because I love that. I've been thinking a lot recently about equitable assessment and how, if we have this very inclusive classroom, but then we give a traditional test at the end or, it kind of self-defeats that inclusive environment. And also thinking just about rubrics, grading participation, and how a lot of times that brings in implicit bias that as educators we're not aware of, that may affect students with disabilities, that may affect students with different language practices, with different cultural backgrounds than us, and we don't even see that. A lot of times we see, oh, well, participation, we're grading efforts, so that's actually equitable. But we're seeing so many equity issues within that loaded term participation. So Lynn, when you were talking about that, that's what it made me think of, is widening the aperture on what is participation. What does that mean, and how can we encourage it in more ways than we have in the past?
Mhm. Well, thank you for that, Meg. I appreciate the non-traditional environment, like thinking about what's required to be able to be really fair and equitable in those kinds of interactions with students. I want to be sure to touch on a few of the things that you ladies are working on in regards to this conversation. Lynn, you're working with a variety of educational systems right now through constellations throughout the state and across the country. What does the conversation about equitable and comprehensive approaches, where does that begin? How do you begin to see a level of impact that you will hope to achieve in classrooms when you're talking with various administrators and policymakers? Like, what do they need to know and do to be more effective in their efforts?
Yeah, thank you for that question. If I'm being honest, like conversations about bias and racist habits, that is very hard to do at like the state level. In a state like Georgia, that kind of doesn't happen. Our conversations about supporting teachers and expanding access and equity, most often occur at the school level. I'm just sharing my experiences or our experiences thus far. It's sort of that kind of environment that makes this work even more important. And so I just kind of wanted to say that to kind of set the context. Every state is different, but I'm betting that many people are having difficulty and challenges in having the deep, discussions on equity and race and racism in computer science. Very difficult and challenging at the state level. So what we've done is we've rolled out a comprehensive practice of teacher support and professional development. And what we want to do is we want to bring that growth and development into the classroom, where the teaching and learning is examined through a coaching experience. This is a best practice, that's existed for decades. And in computer science, we know that this takes time, right? And it takes relationship building and addressing bias and racist habits, that we need to eradicate from the classrooms. It's the one thing in our education system and even in the tech industry that we have to understand that becoming aware of bias and these racist habits, that this is a personal journey. And so these are the conversations that we're, having with as many educators as possible. And that there is power in a coaching approach, such that when educators come to that personal realization, that it is extremely effective in building equitable classroom community. And yes, it is important that we raise content knowledge. Yes, it is important that we do that. But we also have to be very tuned into the practices that are going to, provide the opportunities for Black children, for Hispanic children, Latino children, Native American children, the opportunities that they deserve. And one more thing that I'll say about what we're working on too, we need to be very tuned into ensuring that teachers are enjoying the profession, that this isn't, an assessment on their work. It's not an assessment on them. It's not. We are trying to elevate teachers. We are trying to elevate the teaching profession, and do as much as we can to ensure that they are enjoying it. That is very important also believe it or not, in building that classroom culture that is needed in computer science classrooms.
Thank you so much for that, Lynn. Dr. Israel, I saw you nodding your head in agreement, and I know that you're based in Florida, and there are similar challenges. Your research, you're focusing on supporting students with disabilities and learning differences to ensure that they feel more supported in the classroom. Like, what does that look like in theory and practice, and like how is successful engagement measured?
Great, thank you. And I'll echo everything. I was nodding my head and plus letting everything Lynn you were saying too, to both the state challenges and to empowering teachers. I guess what I'll say is that we've been on this journey with advocacy around inclusion of students with disabilities. And our first research studies were just there to prove that students with disabilities can be successful if they have access to accessible and inclusive practices. And I kind of feel like we're beyond that, but we're still at a point where if a student is not succeeding in the classroom, there is a tendency to assume that that is because of something that's intrinsic to the student. They can't do it because of, whatever that issue. And so the research that we're showing is that if we can empower teachers with the instructional strategies to meet the needs of their learners, we start to see this shift from like, oh, I wish, so-and-so could be successful, but ... fill in whatever the reasons, to like, okay, if I can use strategies such as universal design for learning, if I can help students unpack kind of those metacognitive processes, what happens when you debug a project, I can see that students can be successful. So that's really the shift that we're seeing, where teachers who really do want to do the right thing for their kids have the tools in their toolkits to be able to do so. And so strategies such as universal design for learning and metacognitive self-regulation and practicing kind of sitting in frustration are the kind of things that we're seeing are the most successful. And teachers, I guess, they're surprised at how well their students are doing, but we're saying we need to assume competence. We need to assume that kids can if they're given the tools. Just like with all of us, if we need a strategy to learn something, we learn and we use that strategy, and then we find success. So there's nothing magic there. It's really about providing those tools for the teachers to be able to support all their learners.
I love that, focusing on problem solving and teachers really thinking differently about the way they're engaging with their students, as opposed to the opposite way around, to, to be able to help students thrive. I really appreciate your sentiments on that. Before we hop into questions, and I think we have one question, so please feel free if you have questions to place them in the Q&A. Meg, I just want to check in with you before we hop into questions. You're certainly, you have a lot of experience in this field. You've created computer science curricula and designed software. What are the type of supports and advice that districts and school administrators seek when they request your services? And, where do you begin with that? What's the easy message to convey to them? What's the most challenging when it comes to their work and what they're looking for?
Sure. Well, I think the easiest and most challenging is that computer science is for all students. It's easiest because it's a very simple message, and administrators are often very on board with it. But then when we dig into what do we mean by all students? For example, in New York City, we have self-contained special education classrooms for students who are labeled with like moderate to severe disabilities or multiple disabilities. And we mean those students too, right? And then on a district level, thinking about, okay, well, CS is for all students, but what's happening at this school over here that maybe they have some behavior issues and they're behind on their math and ELA scores. What kind of CS, what quality of CS are they getting? And then at the school down the road that has a gifted and talented program, and their scores are up, so they don't have as many eyes on them, right? Their students are probably getting a much higher quality of CS. So really looking and digging into what do we mean by CS is for all students. So it's the same high quality CS, and it really is all students. And so sometimes that does take a while to dig into, because those are really complex systems that we're trying to dig into. And they're really complex systems involving much more than CS that we're trying to change, which to me is the most exciting part, but is also really one of the biggest barriers, right?
Because it's comprehensive work, because you're serving whole human beings. So I can imagine what it's like to be able, you have these various administrators with, things that they have to be able to address. And, so taking, going deeper, I'm certain I can understand that for sure. Let me make sure I touch on questions. And if you have questions, please feel free, because I can keep talking. I can keep asking these lovely ladies questions. But this one comes from Kyla. It says, are there any common assumptions and mistakes teachers make without realizing that reduce inclusiveness in the classroom that we can watch out for?
Let me start with one that we see a lot, which is that teachers want to help their kids and sometimes they overhelp. And this kind of goes back to some of this assumed competence. Oftentimes we want to protect students, but that's really not a role as teacher. A role is to empower kids. And so what we want to do is use data, use evidence to see what level of support students need and provide that, and then scaffold back as students gain additional expertise. And so that's a pretty common one that is very well-meaning teachers will do with students with disabilities, that I think is one to consider.
I also want to, Maya, you bring up an excellent point, and I also want to bring up the, identity piece in this work. The intersectionality of how a student identifies themselves is something that needs to be honored, especially in computer science classrooms. LGBTQ students often find themselves very isolated and in a very threatening environment in computer science, as well as, our Black students, our Hispanic students. And I will also raise the fact that many Asian students also find themselves in a very sort of threatening type of environment in computer science, even though they may be overrepresented. And it is, and I think that we, I think the question was asking about some assumptions and some mistakes. I think all of those are some assumptions, slash mistakes that we often make as educators. And so we need to maybe, learn to adapt a different way of thinking about our students and really showing ways to be respectful and honor their identity, and that there are intersectionalities that exist that we may not be aware of, but that there are many ways to be able to, like I said, honor the different ways and intersectionality that students are identifying themselves now. Yeah, I'll just pause there.
I'll throw in another one, and this one came from some work that Deborah Karuki did in Maryland, and that is so. I was working with her on a fellowship where we were creating teaching simulations for pre-service teachers that really focused on how do you teach CS equitably. So we were trying to set up some situations that would cause teachers to then have to question their biases. And one that really rang true for me was Deborah's. And what she found was she had students in like an AP course, and two students who were the top students in the class, one boy, one girl, they both finished early. And then as the pre-service teacher is to go talk to them and give them something to do. Most of the people who who completed the simulation had the male student do more advanced work and had the female student go help others. So she is not, she's not developing her CS skills and pushing them farther. And then the male student is not developing some of the practices, right, that she might be gaining on the flip side of that. But I think that's one that I recognize that I did as a teacher and that I've seen in countless classrooms.
Mhm, mhm. Wow.
So let me add to that a little bit, kind of going back to some of the research that we're doing. And I know that we've got folks here who are doing research either in their classroom or in their district or wherever they're doing it. Collecting the data on who's participating and looking at it in an intersectional way is really important. We don't have a lot of data on participation of students with disabilities. We're in New York, we're starting to get it, but when you start to look at the intersectionality of gender and disability and race and socioeconomics, you start to see where some of the gaps are. I mean, there's some general gaps that we know about, but being a little bit more deliberate about who is in your classroom, who's not in your classroom, who is in your research studies, and how you're able to learn whether particular students are benefiting more or less than some of these challenges, Meg, like what you were saying. You start to see it at scale and you can start to address it at scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so interesting because the data, when you just look at the data, you could see all these students in class, enrolled in class, right? But you don't see what's happening in the class, who's actually in the room when the class happens.
Yeah, and let me just give you a quick example of that. So some of the work that we're doing when we're looking at just general participation of students with and without disabilities, we're not seeing very major differences. But then we start looking at categories, right? Who gets categorized? And that's a whole other, we could have a whole other talk about, categorization and marginalization and racism. But looking at it by disability categorization plus gender plus socioeconomics, you can start to see that there are some trends that are really important to unpack.
Mm-hmm. There is so much to unpack here, and we have already run through our entire hour. I knew this was going to go fast. I didn't realize how fast it was going to go. So I really appreciate the three of you. We'll have to bring you back for another conversation to be able to dive even a little bit deeper. Thank you so much to you and to our audience for really enriching us with your energy for this work and your wonderful questions and your wisdom. And the next part of this series, we're going to touch on the third core component of our framework, which examines ways to develop rigorous curricula and pedagogy. And that's October 20th, 2021. So please stay tuned for information about that. That's coming your way really soon. We have a dynamic panel that I have to start preparing for now to be able to have, a thoughtful conversation with these, just amazing people. So as always, please stay connected with us, with our team. We will share contact information from our panelists who want to be able to engage with all of you as an audience. And we just appreciate your time this evening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and we look forward to more in the future. So we will see you hopefully back here October 20th. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was amazing. Really appreciate all of your insights. That was so fantastic.
Yes, indeed. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Scott. We appreciate you as always. Have a great evening, everyone. Stay safe out there.
You too. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.